Okay, let's unpack this. This whole idea of no enemies. I mean, in a world like ours, so much conflict.
hmm
What does that even mean? It sounds, well, almost impossibly idealistic, maybe even a bit naive.
Yeah, it really does. It cuts right against our sort of conditioned response, doesn't it? We tend to think in boxes, us and them, friend and foe, and this idea just throws a wrench in that.
Totally. And for this deep dive, we've gathered, well, a really fascinating range of sources. We're looking at ancient philosophy, religious teachings, some really compelling modern examples, even digging into the deeper kind of metaphysical side of it.
Right. And it's important to say, like you hinted, it's clearly not about pretending conflict doesn't exist or, just rolling over when harm is done.
No, exactly.
It seems to be more about exploring a fundamentally different stance towards other people, even people who are actively opposing you or, causing real suffering.
Right. So our mission here really is to go beyond that surface reaction, to try and pull out the core insights, the really transformative bits from all this material we've looked at.
hmm How has this principle actually shown up across different cultures and times? What are the different facets of it? From practical day-to-day ethics right through to these big, profound worldviews. We want to help you get a handle on the sheer depth and breadth of this very challenging idea.
Couldn't have said it better. Think of this as a journey into some really tough questions humanity has wrestled with. Questions about conflict, about compassion, about how we relate to each other.
We're hitting ancient wisdom, grappling with some tricky ethical dilemmas, and looking at these incredible people who actually tried to live this out.
Yeah. What does it actually take, deep down, to say, to really mean it, I have no enemies? Let's jump in. Where should we start? Maybe ancient Greece.
That's a good place. Let's start in the West with some of the foundational thinkers. Socrates comes to mind immediately.
Socrates.
Right.
The sources really emphasize something they call his great proposition. And it sounds like it was, well, pretty mind-blowing for his time. Honestly, it still feels pretty radical now.
It really does. He wasn't just sort of suggesting this lightly. The sources paint it as a core truth he felt he'd reasoned his way to. And the idea is basically this. It is never right to harm another person. Full stop.
Never.
Never. Not even someone who has harmed you first. Not even someone you would definitely call an enemy.
Wow. Okay, hold on. Never harm an enemy. I mean, that flies in the face of, well, everything, doesn't it? Basic instinct, retribution, an eye for an eye. How do you even get there?
Well, his reasoning, as the sources lay it out, often circled back to this core idea. Doing harm, committing an injustice, is fundamentally worse for the person doing the harming. It damages their soul, their inner self, more than suffering harm damages the victim.
Okay, unpack that a bit. Worse for the perpetrator.
Yeah. Your own moral integrity, your character, your, let's say, inner goodness, that's the most precious thing you have, according to this view. And when you intentionally harm someone else, you corrupt that. You degrade yourself.
See.
So retaliating, striking back, even against someone who seems to deserve it. From Socrates' perspective, that's a kind of self-inflicted wound, a spiritual injury. It's this really strict ethic of non-retaliation, all grounded in protecting your own character above everything else.
That's quite a shift in focus, isn't it? It's not about the other person's deserving it, but about the corrosive effect on you. And the sources mention, we see this played out dramatically in Plato's dialogue, Crito.
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic example. Socrates is in prison, condemned to death by the Athenian court. You could absolutely argue those judges, those accusers, were his enemies at that point. They were causing him the ultimate harm.
Right.
And his wealthy friend Crito comes along and says, look, I've arranged everything. We can get you out. You can escape, live in exile, a clear path to safety.
But Socrates says no.
He refuses. And his argument is fascinating. He basically says, I've lived my whole life benefiting from the laws of Athens. I implicitly agreed to abide by them. I can't just break that agreement now, even if the laws are being applied unjustly to me.
So his commitment to this higher principle, the integrity of the law, maybe his whole philosophy of not doing wrong even when wrong, it overrides his own survival instinct, his, perfectly understandable anger or resentment.
It seems so. His accusers, the court, they're acting as his enemies, causing his death. But he chooses not to fight back by breaking the law, not to become unjust himself in response to their injustice. He accepts his fate. It's this stark, powerful demonstration of prioritizing that inner stance, that principle, over lashing out at external foes. He won't let their injustice implicate him in ugliness, as some later thinkers might put it.
Okay, so let's bring this home. Why does this ancient Socratic idea still resonate? How does his argument that harming others, even enemies, is worse for you? How does that challenge your gut reaction when you feel attacked or wronged today? Does this idea of never harm based on protecting your own soul does it feel workable? Or even desirable, maybe?
It really makes you pause, doesn't it? It forces you to think about the hidden costs of retaliation. Not just what it does to the other person, but what it does to you. Is winning by causing harm really a victory for your own character, for your own peace of mind? It's a deep question.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, building on that, let's shift from Socrates to the Roman Stoics. Thinkers like Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, they seem to pick up similar threads, but maybe with more emphasis on managing our inner world and maybe a broader sense of compassion.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The Stoics were, intensely practical in many ways. Their whole philosophy revolved around distinguishing what's in our control, our thoughts, our judgments, our responses from what's not in our control, external events, other people's actions.
Right. Control the controllables.
Exactly. And the no enemies idea fits really well here because they essentially shift the battleground inwards. It's less about changing the external enemy and more about mastering your internal reaction to them.
The source material highlights a really interesting piece of advice from Seneca. Remember that an enemy may become a friend.
That immediately introduces this dynamic quality, doesn't it? Enmity isn't necessarily fixed. People change, relationships change. It opens up possibility.
Yeah, it does. And he also talks about checking hatred in the enemy. What do you think he meant by that?
It's a bit ambiguous, but one way to read it is that maybe your response, if you remain calm, rational, maybe even show some goodwill, could actually influence their hatred. It might disarm them, or at least temper their hostility.
So put some agency back on us. Our reaction isn't just passive. It could potentially change the dynamic.
Potentially, yeah. Instead of just mirroring their anger or aggression, you try to introduce a different element into the interaction. It's a very Stoic idea. Focus on your own virtuous response.
But maybe the deepest Stoic reflections on this come from the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations. The sources really stress his constant self-examination, his effort to cultivate empathy, even for people acting unjustly.
He's famous for that morning routine, isn't he? Where he'd prepare himself mentally for the day by thinking about the difficult people he might encounter.
Right, like the meddling, the ungrateful, the arrogant.
The treacherous, the envious, the unsocial, all those lovely types. But the point wasn't to gear up for a fight. It was actually the opposite. It was to remind himself of a fundamental Stoic truth.
Which was?
That these people, even the ones acting badly, fundamentally share our human nature. They're part of the same rational universe. And crucially, as he puts it, none of them can implicate me in ugliness.
Okay, implicate me in ugliness. Let's unpack that phrase. What's he really getting at there?
I think he means their bad actions, their negativity, their injustice. None of that forces me to become ugly in response. Their choices are theirs. My choices, my inner state, my response, those are mine. I don't have to descend to their level. I don't have to let their perceived enmity poison my character. I remain in control of my own virtue.
And the sources also point out his refusal to, quote, defeat any individual. He saw anger, the desire to dominate, as somehow unnatural against the cosmic order.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really core Stoic concept that's fundamental to understanding their take on no enemies. Sympathia.
Sympathia.
Sounds important.
It is. It's this belief in a totally unified, interconnected cosmos. Humans, animals, nature, the stars, and it's all part of one single living, rational whole. Like interconnected parts of one giant organism.
Okay, so a deeply interconnected reality. How does that big metaphysical idea connect back to the practical idea of having no enemies?
Well, think about it. If everything is truly connected, if we're all parts of the same whole, Marcus uses the analogy of feet, hands, and eyes, all working together for the body, then harming another part of that whole is literally harming yourself. It's like the hand attacking the foot. It makes no sense from the perspective of the whole organism.
Right, it's self-destructive on a cosmic level.
Precisely. So an enlightened Stoic, someone who really grasps sympathia, understands that acting against another person is acting against the cosmic order, against the whole, and ultimately against themselves because they are part of that whole. So the very idea of a truly separate enemy just falls apart.
From that viewpoint, yes. It becomes philosophically incoherent. It's not just morally wrong to harm them, it's acting against the fundamental structure of reality as they understand it. So for someone deeply living that understanding, they effectively have no enemies because their worldview just doesn't support that kind of ultimate separation and opposition.
Yeah, that's a profound way of looking at it. The focus shifts entirely to your own inner state and your understanding of this deep interconnectedness. So how does seeing the world through this lens of sympathy, this profound connection, how might that change how you view people you clash with or people who seem to be acting against your interests? Does it make them feel less other, less deserving of hostility?
I think it has to, right? It invites you to see them not as some alien force to be defeated, but as, well, fellow travelers in this interconnected system. Maybe they're acting out of ignorance, maybe they're struggling themselves, but they're still fundamentally connected to you. The struggle then becomes less about vanquishing them and more about maintaining your own equilibrium and virtue within that shared reality.
Okay, fascinating start in the West. Now let's shift our focus east. How do these themes, harmony, getting beyond conflict, deep compassion, show up in Eastern traditions? It's always interesting to see similar ideas bubbling up in different contexts.
Absolutely, and often framed through slightly different, though sometimes overlapping, concepts. Let's begin with Confucianism in China. This is a tradition really deeply concerned with social harmony, right, relationships, ethical conduct within a society.
Right. The goal is a well-ordered community where everyone knows their role and fulfills their duties. And in that kind of system, personal grudges, enmity, conflict, those are really seen as damaging forces, aren't they? Undermining the whole social fabric.
Exactly. So Confucius offered a lot of practical advice on how to manage relationships, including how to deal with people who wrong you. The sources bring up a really famous exchange where someone asked him about repaying injury with kindness, that radical forgiveness idea.
Ah, in a sense, it wasn't just a simple yes, was it? He famously said something like, repay injustice with justice and repay kindness with kindness. That sounds different.
It is quite distinct, isn't it? It's not quite turn the other cheek. It's not advocating for revenge either, but it's also not saying you should just ignore the harm. Repay injustice with justice. The character for justice there also implies straightness, uprightness. So it means responding to wrongdoing with fairness, with proportionality, sticking to what's ethically correct yourself.
So uphold justice. Don't get drawn into personal vengeance or simply absorb the hit without any response.
That seems to be the idea. Address the wrong, but do it righteously, according to principle. Don't let their injustice make you unjust. Meanwhile, continue to meet goodness with goodness. It's about maintaining your own ethical balance and upholding social order, rather than just reacting emotionally.
So it's a kind of forgiveness in the sense of not letting personal resentment fester and disrupt things, but it doesn't rule out a just, principled response.
Exactly. But then, woven into the broader Confucian tradition and Chinese culture generally, there's also this strong emphasis on the virtue of magnanimity.
Magnanimity, like large-heartedness,
Well,
generosity of spirit.
Precisely, cultivating a kind of benevolence, a tolerance, even towards people who have acted as adversaries. And the reason for this, within that Confucian framework, is exactly to stop those feelings of enmity, those grudges, from taking root and poisoning the individual and the community. It's an active cultivation of goodwill.
And the sources mentioned there's also a classic Chinese saying that goes, forgive injuries and love your enemies.
Right. Which shows the layers, doesn't it? You have Confucius's specific guidance on acting justly in response to injustice, but you also have this broader cultural ideal pushing towards forgiveness and benevolence as the desired inner state, perhaps aligning more closely with that no enemies spirit we see elsewhere. It's about the heart you cultivate for the good of everyone.
So how does this Confucian blend justice in response, but also cultivating magnanimity?
Yeah.
How does that land with you? Does that idea of responding to injustice with justice feel more practical maybe than just unconditional forgiveness? And what role does that idea of magnanimity play, not just in ancient China, but maybe in keeping our own communities or relationships healthy today?
It definitely offers a framework that tries to balance things, doesn't it? It acknowledges the need for fairness and ethical boundaries, but it also holds up this ideal of rising above personal bitterness for the sake of something larger, whether that's social harmony or just, healthier connections between people.
Okay, let's shift gears again within Eastern thought. Let's talk about Taoism, especially Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. Now, this feels like a very different perspective, less about social rules, more about aligning with what? The natural flow of things, the Tao.
Exactly. Taoism comes at conflict and duality from a completely different angle. It tends to view many of the distinctions we make, good, bad, right, wrong, friend, enemy, as, well, kind of artificial, products of our limited human minds imposing categories on a reality that's fundamentally unified and flowing.
And Laozi describes the sage, the person who's really in tune with this Tao, as being unconcerned with friends and enemies, with good and harm, with honor and disgrace. That sounds almost detached.
It can sound that way, but it's not really indifference in a cold sense. It's more about transcendence. The sage has moved beyond being attached to these conventional labels and judgments that are the very source of so much conflict and division. They see the bigger picture, the underlying unity, friend, enemy. These are just temporary roles, relative positions in the constant flux of the Tao, not ultimate realities to get worked up about.
The sources also mention patience. Patient with both friends and enemies, you accord with the way things are.
Yeah, and that patience isn't just gritting your teeth. It's seen as a deep alignment with reality itself. The Tao flows, things change, relationships shift. The sage doesn't fight this flow or try to impose rigid categories on it. They move with it. Being patient with both friend and enemy means accepting the natural ebb and flow without resistance or judgment.
And this ties back to that Taoist holistic view that these hard lines we draw, especially us versus them, are basically illusions created by our own minds.
That's a core part of it. The mind loves duality, loves creating these pairs of opposites. Taoism suggests that from the perspective of the Tao, these are just surface appearances. The sage looks deeper, sees the underlying unity, the constant change, and so these rigid distinctions lose their power, their grip.
So how does the sage act then when faced with someone who seems like an enemy? The sources say they simply perform their task and withdraw.
It suggests acting appropriately in the situation, in alignment with the Tao, doing what needs to be done, but without egoic attachment, without clinging to the outcome, without needing to win or define themselves against the other person. They do their part, and then they let go. They don't get caught up in celebrating friends or fearing enemies because, from that higher perspective, the categories themselves are seen as kind of unreal, or at least impermanent. They operate from a place of deep inner stillness that isn't easily disturbed by the drama of human conflicts.
Okay, so how might this Taoist angle matter to you, listening now? How could intentionally stepping back from those quick judgments, from that intense emotional investment in labels like friend or enemy, how could that help dissolve feelings of conflict in your own life? What does it really mean to try and be unconcerned in this Taoist sense, not uncaring, but free from the clinging and aversion tied to these labels?
It really offers a pathway to freedom, doesn't it? Freedom from the mental habits that trap us in cycles of conflict. It suggests that by shifting our inner perspective, by trying to align more with the natural flow and less with our rigid judgments, the whole landscape of our relationships could actually change quite dramatically.
From the flow of the Tao, let's move to Buddhism. Here, it feels like the idea of living without enmity isn't just, a helpful practice or something for advanced sages. It's presented almost as a core foundational principle for everyone.
Yes, absolutely. The Buddhist teachings are incredibly direct and central about this. The sources give us that key quote from the Dhammapada, which is a collection of his sayings. Hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is an ancient and eternal law.
Ancient and eternal law. That's a really strong statement, isn't it? It's not just saying this is a good idea, it's saying this is how reality works, like a law of emotional physics.
Exactly. It's presenting it as a fundamental principle of cause and effect in the realm of the mind and emotions, trying to put out the fire of hatred with more hatred. It just fuels the flames. The only thing that actually has the power to dissolve hatred, according to this law, is its opposite. Love, compassion, goodwill metta in Pali. It's not just wishful thinking, it's the basic mechanics of the heart.
And the sources explain the Buddhist reasoning behind why this works. And it comes back to that shared experience of suffering, doesn't it? The idea that all beings, every single one, wants happiness and wants to avoid pain.
That insight is absolutely crucial. Recognizing that fundamental kinship, that the person you see as an enemy is driven by the exact same core desires and fears as you are, that's the key that unlocks compassion. When you truly see that shared vulnerability, that shared longing for well-being, the hard boundary between self and other, friend and enemy, starts to soften, maybe even dissolve.
And this understanding becomes really central in Mahayana Buddhism, especially with the Bodhisattva vow. That's the commitment to work for the liberation of all beings, right?
Yes, all sentient beings, without exception. And all explicitly includes those who've harmed you, those you dislike, those you fear. The Bodhisattva path inherently demands universal compassion, precisely because everyone is caught in the same cycle of seeking happiness and experiencing suffering. There's no picking and choosing who deserves your compassion.
The Dalai Lama, as quoted in the sources, really brings this down to earth. He says something like, "Every single being, even hostile ones, fears suffering and seeks happiness. So let us take care of others wholeheartedly, both friends and enemies." This is the basis for true compassion.
It's so clear, isn't it? Compassion isn't earned by being nice to us. It's grounded in the simple universal fact of shared sentience, shared desire for happiness, shared fear of pain. That shared reality, he's saying, is the solid foundation on which you can build genuine care and concern and extend it outwards, even to those who act as adversaries.
And then there's that really provocative Mahayana idea, viewing enemies as spiritual teachers.
That sounds, well, frankly, kind of crazy at first listen. It does sound paradoxical. But it's actually a very powerful reframing technique. Think about it. Where do we really grow spiritually? Usually through challenges, right? Especially in developing qualities like patience, tolerance, forgiveness, deep compassion.
Okay.
Well, who provides a better, more intense workout for your patience than someone who is actively pushing your buttons or causing you harm? Who gives you a more profound opportunity to cultivate compassion than someone you find it genuinely difficult to feel warmth towards?
So they're not obstacles to your practice, they are the practice.
Yeah.
Like resistance training for the soul.
Exactly. They provide the necessary friction, the grit that helps you polish those virtues. If you only ever hung out with people you like and agreed with, how would you ever really develop deep patience or unconditional love? An enemy forces you to confront your own anger, your own judgments, your own aversion head on. And by working with those internal reactions right there in the face of the provocation, that's how you build real spiritual muscle and insight. They become unintentional teachers, showing you where your work lies.
Okay, that reframing is powerful. So why does this Buddhist perspective, with its emphasis on shared suffering and seeing challenges as teachers, why does that matter so deeply to you listening now? How might viewing difficulties with others, even really painful conflicts, as potential lessons actually change how you experience them? Could it lessen the sting, maybe, or help you find a way through?
It definitely shifts the power dynamic, doesn't it? You might not be able to control what other people do, but Buddhism offers this framework and specific practices like mindfulness and compassion meditation to help you control your internal response. It suggests you can transform those challenging encounters from just painful experiences into catalysts for your own growth and deeper understanding. It puts the agency back in your hands.
We've covered a lot of ground, ancient West, major Eastern traditions. Now let's turn towards the Abrahamic traditions, specifically focusing on Christianity, where the teaching about enemies feels, perhaps, the most direct, the most explicit, and for many, the most demanding.
Yes, it's absolutely central to the teachings of Jesus, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, and it's presented without much ambiguity.
The core teaching, pulled from the sources, Matthew 5.44, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I mean, that goes way beyond just not hating them, doesn't it? It's commanding, active, positive engagement.
It's incredibly radical. It pushes past non-retaliation, past even just passive non-resistance. It's calling for active agape, that kind of unconditional, creative goodwill and even prayer directed towards the very people who are causing you harm, who are persecuting you.
And the implication seems to be, as the sources suggest, that followers are called to be peacemakers. The goal isn't to win, to defeat the enemy, but maybe reconciliation. Or at least maintaining that loving stance, regardless of what they do.
Exactly. And predictably, this command has led to centuries of intense discussion, debate, and struggle within Christian thought and practice. The sources mention figures like Augustine. Facing the realities of the crumbling Roman Empire, the need for defense, he developed what became the just war tradition.
Right. The idea that war, while terrible, might sometimes be a necessary evil, a moral duty even, under very strict conditions, to prevent worse evils.
Precisely. Just war theory tries to define when going to war might be justified, jus ad bellum, and how war must be conducted ethically, jus in bello. It puts serious moral constraints around warfare.
But in doing so, it inherently accepts the category of enemy as a real thing that sometimes must be fought, right? Even if the fight is meant to be morally limited.
Yes, it operates within that reality. It tries to reconcile that radical command to love with what are seen as the unavoidable responsibilities of protecting the innocent or upholding justice in a fallen world. But then the sources also point to the strong pacifist stream within Christianity.
Like Tertullian early on or Tolstoy much later?
Exactly. They looked at that command, love your enemies, and took it as an absolute. For them, any participation in violence, especially the organized violence of war, was fundamentally incompatible with following Jesus' teaching. Full stop.
So you have this real tension throughout Christian history. How do you live out love your enemies when faced with violent aggression or systemic injustice, especially at a state level?
It's a profound ethical dilemma. But interestingly, the sources highlight an idea that emerged from this wrestling. The notion that even those who commit horrific acts, think executioners, oppressors, even they are somehow deserving of compassion, understanding, or at least prayer.
That really pushes the boundaries, doesn't it? Extending the idea of human worth, the scope of compassion, even to perpetrators of great harm.
It suggests a fundamental human dignity that can't be entirely erased no matter how terrible the actions. It implies they are still potential recipients of love, or at least prayer, still connected to the possibility of redemption. It radically challenges who we consider worthy of a compassionate stance.
And this teaching found incredibly powerful expression in the 20th century through someone like Martin Luther King Jr. He explicitly built his movement on this foundation.
Absolutely. His whole philosophy of nonviolent resistance was saturated with this command. The sources, quote, his definition of agape love, not warm, fuzzy feelings, but creative, understanding goodwill for all men. The refusal to defeat any individual.
Refusal to defeat any individual. There's that echo again, like Marcus Aurelius.
It's striking, isn't it? King passionately believed that every single person, no matter what they'd done, retained a spark of the divine image. That made them inherently worthy of this act of goodwill. His movement wasn't aimed at destroying or humiliating the segregationists. It aimed to awaken their conscience, to achieve reconciliation, always starting from that premise of shared humanity.
He even taught that you have to start by looking inside the person who hates you to find some element of good.
Yeah, it's a demanding spiritual exercise. It doesn't mean ignoring the hate or the harm they're causing. It means looking deeper, past the behavior, to see the complex human being underneath maybe someone acting out of fear, ignorance, or their own suffering. It's about recognizing their potential, their inherent connection to the good.
And then that really challenging instruction he gave. When you actually gain the power to defeat your enemy, that's the moment you should instead choose to forgive and help them. That, he said, is the meaning of love.
That's the absolute summit of the practice, isn't it? It's not just nonviolence when you're weak. It's choosing active benevolence precisely when you could dominate or retaliate. For King, that was the revolutionary power of loving your enemies. His whole struggle was a bet on the idea that embracing enmity was a dead end for everyone, and that true liberation required breaking that cycle through this radical redemptive love.
So this Christian command to actively love, to pray for those who persecute you, how does that sit with you? Does it feel like an impossible ideal? What kind of personal changes or even wider social shifts could happen if people really tried to live by that, even imperfectly?
It certainly pushes us to confront the limits of our own capacity for empathy, doesn't it? And it challenges the very common assumption that justice requires retribution. It holds out the possibility of a completely different path, a transformative one, even if it seems incredibly difficult to walk.
Okay, so we've journeyed through these incredibly rich philosophical and religious traditions, and inevitably they all feed into this fundamental ethical debate that is very much alive today. How should we respond to conflict, especially large-scale conflict? Can we ever ethically or justly engage in conflict with those we define as enemies?
Yeah, this really brings a discussion from the realm of personal ethics into the sphere of collective action, politics, international relations.
And the sources frame this as a long-running debate with two main poles. On one side, there's the just war tradition, which we touched on with Augustine.
Right. Just war theory, developed over centuries by thinkers like Aquinas and others, argues that war, while inherently tragic, isn't always wrong. Sometimes it might be a necessary evil, maybe even a moral duty if it's undertaken for a just cause, with the right intention, as a last resort, by a legitimate authority, and with a reasonable hope of success. Those are some of the conditions.
So while it tries hard to put moral limits on war, it fundamentally accepts that there are situations where you have an enemy that needs to be confronted with force, albeit ethically constrained force.
Exactly. It operates within a world where conflict between groups is seen as a reality, and it seeks to provide moral guidelines for navigating that reality. It assumes conflict is sometimes unavoidable, maybe even morally required, to prevent greater harms. It doesn't reject the enemy category itself.
Okay. And then contrasting sharply with that is pacifism.
Right. Pacifism, in its various forms, fundamentally rejects war and violence as legitimate tools for resolving conflict, period.
The source material, referencing the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, summarizes the core pacifist argument like this. Organized massive killing is simply inherently immoral. Therefore, war can never be morally justified, no matter how just the cause might seem.
It's an absolute moral stance against institutionalized violence. Pacifists argue that the means warfare, killing, are so inherently destructive and morally corrupting that they negate any supposedly good end you might be trying to achieve. The cure is worse than the disease, essentially.
And instead of violence, pacifism actively promotes cultivating what the sources call pacific virtues. What are those again?
Things like tolerance, patience, mercy, forgiveness, and love. These are seen as the essential tools for engaging with conflict, even when facing enemies or aggression.
And these aren't just passive qualities, right? In the pacifist view, they're active forces, alternative forms of power.
Exactly. They're the basis for nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, mediation, moral persuasion, the active strategies a pacifist might employ. It's not about doing nothing. It's about using different, non-destructive means to achieve change and resist injustice, means rooted in these core virtues.
And this is where figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. come back in again. Their philosophies, ahimsa, non-harm for Gandhi, non-violent direct action for King, are direct applications of this pacifist thinking, according to the sources.
Absolutely. Their movements were built on this deep conviction that resorting to violence, even against brutal opponents, would ultimately undermine their own moral standing and corrupt their cause. They believed that lasting, positive change came through appealing to the conscience, through demonstrating unwavering moral consistency, and by refusing to mirror the violence of the oppressor, even if it meant immense suffering and risk.
The sources make a really powerful point here, that this kind of radical nonviolence, as lived by Gandhi and King, actually incarnates the no enemies principle. It makes it a living, breathing reality in the world.
Yeah, it's essentially saying, I refuse to relate to you, my adversary, through the framework of violence and enmity. I will oppose the injustice you represent, I will resist, but I will do so in a way that affirms our shared humanity, that holds open the door for reconciliation, that refuses to accept enemy as the final definition of our relationship.
And Gandhi's statement after Indian independence is just staggering in this context.
It really is. The sources quote him addressing the departing British, the former colonial rulers. Britishers were not our enemies now and will not be our enemies in future. We should love them.
I mean, think about that. After decades of struggle, bitterness, injustice, to stand there at the moment of victory and declare the former adversary is no longer an enemy and should be met with love. That's an almost unbelievable real-world application of this principle on a massive scale. It wasn't forgetting the past. It was a conscious, deliberate choice about how to frame the present and the future, refusing to be burdened by the continuation of enmity.
It's truly remarkable.
So, this whole debate, just war versus pacifism, and these powerful examples of nonviolence, why does this matter to you listening? It presents this stark ethical fork in the road, doesn't it? When, if ever, is fighting okay? What's the real power, but also the immense challenge and risk involved in choosing those pacific virtues, choosing nonviolence, when you're faced with real aggression, whether it's personal or political?
It forces us to think really hard about the true costs, moral, psychological, physical, of different ways of responding to conflict. And it asks us to seriously consider whether the path of non-enmity, as difficult as it is, might ultimately hold more potential for genuine transformation and healing than the path of violence.
These ideas, they aren't just dusty concepts in books or abstract ethical debates. They've been lived out, embodied by some truly incredible people in recent memory, people who deliberately chose to operate from this principle of, I have no enemies, often under the most extreme, crushing circumstances.
Seeing it in action like that, it gives it a different kind of reality, doesn't it? Oh, absolutely. It moves it from philosophy to lived courage to deep personal conviction. The sources bring up Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese literary critic, human rights activist, Nobel Peace Prize winner, who received the prize while imprisoned.
And his famous statement came during his trial in 2009, right, when he was facing a long prison sentence for his peaceful writings and advocacy. He stood there and said, I have no enemies and no hatred, directed at the very officials prosecuting him.
Can you even imagine the inner strength that takes? To be standing before the people who are literally enacting the injustice against you, the instruments of your oppression, and to declare, none of the police Prosecutors, judges are my enemies.
He wasn't pretending they weren't imprisoning him, was he? He wasn't denying the injustice.
No, not at all. But his reasoning, as the sources explain it, was that enmity itself is toxic. It corrupts the individual spirit and it poisons the possibility of a better society. So his chosen response, his internal stance, was to meet that official hostility not with reciprocal hatred, but with goodwill, to refuse to let their actions define his inner state.
It's such a powerful example of choosing your response, choosing your inner landscape, even when external freedom is stripped away, a real-world demonstration under the most intense pressure.
And then, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, who we've mentioned, his lifelong refusal to cultivate personal hatred towards the British, even during the long struggle for independence, is just legendary.
Yeah, the sources mention memoirs reporting him saying things like, "I have no enemies, all are my friends."
Yeah.
Apparently, this was a consistent personal refrain, not just a public stance.
And his actions backed it up. That insistence after independence on treating the departing British with kindness, not as vanquished foes, it wasn't just politics. It flowed directly from his core philosophy. His whole practice of satyagraha, truth force, involved constant self-examination, exposed his own faults, the sources say, alongside this active love for opponents. It was about purifying the means, refusing to let the struggle degenerate into mere hatred, always aiming for that deeper reconciliation.
And Martin Luther King Jr., another modern giant who walked this walk, he truly embodied that Christian command to love adversaries.
His sermon, Loving Your Enemies, is just required reading, really. He breaks down how one might even attempt this seemingly impossible task.
And the sources remind us, he taught, you have to start inside. Look for the good, however small, even in those who hate you. Find that common ground, that shared humanity.
Yeah, it's not about ignoring the hate or pretending it's not harmful. It's about seeing the whole person, looking beyond the hateful act to the human being underneath a person who is maybe misguided, maybe suffering themselves, maybe acting out of fear. King held on to that belief in the inherent worth and potential redeemability of every single person, even those actively fighting against equality and justice.
And it's his most radical instruction. When you actually have the power to crush an enemy, that's precisely the moment you should choose forgiveness and hope instead. That's love in action, he said.
That really raises the bar, doesn't it? It's not just non-retaliation from a position of weakness. It's actively choosing benevolence when you hold the cards. For King, this was the transformative power that could break the endless cycles of hate and revenge. His entire movement was a bet on the idea that enmity was a prison for both the oppressor and the oppressed, and only this kind of radical love could unlock it.
And we see echoes in other modern figures, too. The Dalai Lama consistently teaches that our real enemies aren't other people.
Right. He points inward to anger, hatred, ignorance. Those are the true enemies we need to conquer. And he encourages seeing external adversaries as these invaluable teachers, the grit we need to cultivate boundless compassion. Without friction, the pearl doesn't form.
And Nelson Mandela. Emerging from 27 years in prison, choosing reconciliation over retribution, his famous line quoted in the sources, resentment is like drinking poison and hoping it will kill your enemies.
What a powerful image. It perfectly captures the self-destructive nature of holding on to hatred. Mandela understood that carrying that bitterness would only poison himself and the future of South Africa. Letting go of the enemy label wasn't weakness. It was a profound act of liberation for himself and for his nation, making a different future possible.
So, why do these examples matter so much? These lives lived against the backdrop of such intense injustice and suffering. They show us that this no enemies path is incredibly hard, yes. It takes immense courage, immense inner work. But they also show us it's possible. What can we actually learn from their choices, their actions, that might apply to the conflicts, the hurts, the disagreements in our own, maybe smaller scale lives?
They offer incredibly powerful models, don't they? Models for how to navigate conflict, not just by reacting instinctively, but by consciously choosing a stance. A stance rooted in principle, in compassion, in a refusal to let external negativity dictate your inner state. They show a path that aims for transformation and healing, not just winning or getting even.
Okay, we've explored the ethics, the practicalities, the inspiring lives. Let's go one level deeper now. What's the really fundamental root of this idea, this persistent notion across so many different traditions that it's possible, maybe even essential, to live without enemies? What does it ultimately suggest about reality itself and our place in it?
This is where we get into the really deep water, moving beyond just ethics or psychology into, well, metaphysics or ontology, the study of being itself. And the core idea seems to be, as the sources suggest, that to truly fundamentally live with no enemies, you almost have to adopt a worldview that is, in some sense, non-dual or profoundly interdependent.
Non-dual. Okay, that's a big philosophical term. Break that down for us in this context. What does non-dual mean here?
Basically, it means moving beyond seeing reality as fundamentally split into separate, independent, opposing categories, like self versus other, good versus bad, subject versus object, friend versus enemy. Non-duality points towards recognizing a deeper underlying unity, seeing interconnectedness as the more fundamental truth rather than separation.
Ah, interconnectedness again, like that Stoic idea of sympathia, or the Buddhist understanding of interdependence, the idea that everything is related, part of one big web.
Exactly. In many of the traditions where this no enemies teaching is strongest, it's deeply tied to the sense of fundamental unity or relatedness. The sources mention that famous line from the Hindu Upanishads, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam.
Which means?
The world is one family. It's such a direct, beautiful expression of this interdependent worldview. And if you truly see the world as one family, well, the whole concept of an enemy in the ultimate sense starts to dissolve, doesn't it? Who is truly outside the family?
Right. The category itself becomes problematic.
It does, and many mystical teachings take it even further. They suggest that through certain practices or insights, one can come to genuinely see oneself and others, recognize the shared consciousness, the shared being. And if you truly experience that lack of separation, the very notion of an other who could be your fundamental enemy just collapses. The distinction melts away.
And if we loop back to Marcus Aurelius, his point about humans being born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, that wasn't just a social observation, was it? It had that deeper metaphysical grounding, too.
It really did. For him, our interconnectedness wasn't just a nice idea. It was built into the rational structure of the cosmos itself. That's why he could say that feeling anger acting against another part of the system is unnatural. It violates the fundamental truth of our shared nature within that unified whole. His ethics flowed directly from his understanding of reality. Harming another was harming the system and thus harming yourself as an integral part of it.
And Buddhism, as the sources explain, connects the perception of enemies directly to the illusion of a separate self, anatta.
Yes. The idea is that if you strongly identify with a fixed, solid, independent I, the separate ego that needs constant defense and promotion, then anything or anyone perceived as threatening that ego, challenging its views, frustrating its desires, automatically gets labeled enemy. The ego itself creates the conditions for enmity.
But if you gain insight into anatta, if you start to see that this solid self is actually a fluid process, constantly changing, deeply interdependent with everything else, then the foundation for that rigid us versus them thinking starts to crumble. There isn't a fixed me to be attacked, and there isn't a truly separate fixed them to be the attacker. When you see the interconnectedness and the impermanence of it all, the energy that fuels hatred and the very concept of a fixed enemy lose their solid ground.
So, existentially, what does it mean for your sense of self, for your identity, if you genuinely try to renounce the idea of having enemies?
It's a huge shift.
Yeah.
It means finding or building an identity that is not primarily defined by opposition. So much of our identity, individually and collectively, comes from knowing who we are against. We are the ones who are not them. Letting go of enemies means letting go of that very powerful, very common way of defining ourselves and finding belonging.
So where does meaning come from then, if not from that struggle, that opposition? The sources suggest it comes from connection, from empathy, from recognizing and living in accordance with that deeper reality of interdependence. It's a shift from finding meaning in boundaries and conflict to finding meaning in relatedness and compassion for the whole. It's a fundamental reorientation of where you locate your sense of self and purpose.
And this seems to lead directly to that really potent insight, echoed across traditions, maybe captured most clearly in that Tibetan saying the sources mentioned, attributed to Buddhism. There's no enemy outside our soul. The real enemies live inside us: anger, ego, greed, and hate.
That really brings it all together, doesn't it? It suggests that ultimately the conflicts we experience externally, the people we label as enemies, are often just projections or triggers for the unresolved battles raging within our own minds and hearts. Our own uncontrolled anger, our clinging ego, our insatiable greed, our deep-seated hatreds and ignorance, those are the fundamental adversaries.
So the real challenge, the deepest work, isn't about defeating external foes, but about conquering these internal states.
That seems to be the ultimate implication. The most profound deep dive is the one we take into ourselves. The idea is that if we can genuinely transform these inner enemies, if we can cultivate peace, wisdom, and compassion within, then our perception of the external world inevitably changes. The line between friend and enemy might blur or disappear altogether, not necessarily because other people have changed, but because the inner lens through which we were viewing them, the internal framework that created and sustained those divisions, has been fundamentally transformed.
And why is this final layer, this deep dive inward, matter so much to you, the listener? It really brings the whole concept right back home. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, the enemies you perceive out there are reflecting something back to you about what's in here. What would it truly mean? What would it take to shift your primary focus, to direct your main energy towards transforming your own inner landscape, your anger, your ego, your fear, your hatred, rather than pouring all that energy into trying to change or defeat the people you see as opponents?
It points towards a path to peace, maybe even freedom, that is ultimately within your own sphere of influence, regardless of what others are doing. It poses the question, could mastering your inner world be the most powerful way to change your experience of the outer world?
Wow. Okay. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, really journeying through centuries of human thought and lived experience, all swirling around this incredibly challenging, sometimes deeply uncomfortable, but undeniably resonant idea. I have no enemies.
Yeah, from Socrates' radical non-retaliation and the Stoics' cosmic view in ancient Greece.
To the Confucian balancing act of justice and magnanimity, the Taoist transcendence of opposites, and Buddhism's profound call for universal compassion in the East.
Then the startling Christian command to actively love enemies, the enduring ethical wrestling between just war and pacifism.
And landing on those incredibly moving modern examples, Liu Xiaobo, Gandhi, King, Mandela people who didn't just talk about this, but actually tried to live it, often at immense personal cost.
It's clear this isn't a simple single idea. It's complex, multifaceted, but it's this persistent thread, this powerful undercurrent running through so much of human wisdom traditions.
And wrestling with it, thinking about it, even if you don't fully embrace every aspect, it offers such valuable perspectives, doesn't it? Perspectives on how you might handle conflict differently in your own life, how you might cultivate more inner peace, how you could maybe redefine your relationships, especially with those you find difficult or disagree with strongly.
It really does. It gives you a whole toolkit of alternative ways to respond, ways that go beyond those immediate, often destructive gut reactions of anger or fear or retaliation.
And it pushes us ultimately to ask those really fundamental questions. Where does conflict truly begin? And where does the most effective work for peace need to happen? Is it primarily about changing the external world, controlling or eliminating those we see as enemies?
Or is the deeper leverage point actually internal? Transforming the conditions within ourselves, the anger, the fear, the sense of separation that give rise to the very perception of enmity in the first place.
Which leaves us, and you, with this final provocative thought to carry away, to chew on. If the truest, most fundamental enemies we face are actually internal, our own anger, ego, greed, and hate, what would it really look like to consciously, deliberately direct our greatest energy and effort, not towards fixing or fighting others, but towards transforming ourselves? If you could genuinely achieve some mastery over your own inner landscape, how might the external world and your experience of everyone in it fundamentally shift?
That's a question worth sitting with for a while, a lifetime perhaps.